What do people do on a practical level, given all that, coming to this conversation, interested about where they're at right now when it comes to nutrient levels and how to correct that?
Well, so there's two pieces. One is the making sure that your nutrient intake from diet is optimal. And like I said, even though that's not enough for most of us now, it still is the foundation. We have evolved to absorb nutrients from food. Food has a broad spectrum of nutrients, and the nutrients in certain foods are often complementary. For example, uh, a given food might contain nutrients that we need, as well as cofactors and enzymes that help us to digest and absorb and assimilate those nutrients that we need. So there's a lot of wisdom in how food has evolved, and how, like, we've co-evolved with food over, um, many millennia. And so that's just the natural and appropriate way for us to get most of our nutrition. So if we, and then the second piece is supplementation, which we'll come back to, but I'll focus first on, again, going back to your original question. So, like, what is the most nutrient dense diet if we're focusing on micronutrient intake and amino acid, those building blocks of protein? Before I dive into that, I need to mention one more factor that's really important in this conversation around nutrient density, which often gets left out, and that's bioavailability. So, bioavailability refers to the portion of nutrient that is actually absorbed in the digestive tract and released into the bloodstream for the body's use. And the critical thing to understand here is that the amount of bioavailable nutrients in a given food is almost always lower than the amount of nutrients the food contains, or is listed on the nutritional label. So, for example, the bioavailability of calcium from spinach is terrible. It's 5%. So if you look at a food label of spinach, you'll see, wow, it has 115 milligrams of calcium in one serving. That's awesome. I'm just going to eat spinach, and that's how I'm going to meet all my calcium needs. But then you do the math and you see that you're only going to absorb 6 milligrams of that calcium from that 115 milligrams of spinach. And that means you'd have to consume 16 cups of spinach to get the same bioavailable calcium that you would get from one glass of milk. Now, obviously, not everybody can tolerate dairy. That's a whole nother conversation. But my point here is that the bioavailability of calcium in dairy products is vastly higher than it is in in spinach, because of certain anti-nutrients in spinach, like oxalic acid, that inhibit the absorption of calcium. So there are three factors that impact the bioavailability of nutrients in food. One is the form that the nutrient takes. So an example here would be that with iron, there's a heme form of iron that's found in animal products, and there's a ferrous form of iron that's found in plants. And we know that 15 to 35% of heme iron is absorbed, whereas only 2 to 20% of non-heme or ferrous iron in plant foods is absorbed. So just the form of the nutrient itself makes a huge difference in how much we absorb. The second is the presence or lack of presence of other nutrients that boost bioavailability. And this is referred to nutrient synergy. So an example of this would be, we know that magnesium is required for the metabolism and biotransport of vitamin D. So if you are getting enough vitamin D, but you're magnesium deficient, you actually end up being deficient in vitamin D as well, because not because you're not taking enough in food and supplements, but you don't have this important cofactor of magnesium that helps with the absorption of vitamin D. A similar relationship between copper and iron. If a patient is copper deficient, even if they're getting enough iron, they'll have effective iron deficiency. And I've seen this in my practice many, many times. The third factor is the presence of nutrient inhibitors and anti-nutrients. So I just gave an example of that with spinach and calcium. Spinach contains oxalic acid, which inhibits the absorption of minerals like calcium. So even though you on paper have a lot of calcium in spinach, because of that anti-nutrient or nutrient inhibitor, you're not going to actually absorb that much. So this makes an enormous difference when you're looking at the nutrient density of foods, because if you consider, for example, a 100% plant-based diet with no animal products, you're going to be getting forms of nutrients like the ferrous non-heme form of iron that are more difficult to absorb, a form of zinc that is more difficult to absorb. You're going to be getting alpha-linolenic acid, which is a precursor to EPA or DHA, the long-chain omega-3 fats. Only 0.5% of ALA is converted into DHA, and the list goes on. So you're already fighting an uphill battle from this point in terms of a nutrient density and bioavailability perspective, even though on paper a lot of those plant foods do appear to contain high levels of those nutrients. Now, of course, in other cases, the plant foods don't contain any of the nutrients. That's another problem that can happen with 100% plant-based diet. But the bioavailability factor is rarely mentioned or brought up in these conversations around nutrient density. So if we take all of this into account and we're thinking about micronutrient density, so vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and we're considering the crucial role of bioavailability, what do we know about which foods are most nutrient dense and most bioavailable? Well, thankfully, we have a study to answer this question. This was published in 2022 in the Journal Frontiers of Nutrition. The primary author was Ty Beal, who works for an NGO that is basically focused on ending malnutrition worldwide. And so the question they were asking was, what recommendations can we make from a public health perspective that will give people the biggest bang for their buck, so to speak, in terms of the foods that they eat? Like, what should we be recommending that people eat that will give them the highest amount of nutrients in the lowest amount of food that they can eat? Because cost is always a consideration, especially when you're thinking globally and you're thinking about developing countries as well. So they were particularly looking at the foods that are highest in iron, zinc, folate, vitamin A, calcium, and vitamin B12, since those are the most common micronutrient deficiencies worldwide, including, by the way, in industrialized countries like the United States. Those are still prevalent nutrient deficiencies. And they ranked these foods according to the calories and grams needed to provide about 1/3 of the recommended intakes of those vitamins. So on their scale, a lower score is higher because it means you had to eat less of that food to obtain that 1/3 of the RDA recommended amount. So I want to point out too that this was the first study that actually took bioavailability into account. So inevitably, you'll hear people who hear about this study and they go back and talk about a study that was done 10 or 15 years ago and say, hey, well, this study back then showed that, blueberries were higher in these nutrients than this new study. Well, that's because that previous study didn't consider bioavailability. They didn't consider the forms of nutrients. They didn't consider the anti-nutrients like phytic acid and oxalic acid that can interfere with nutrient absorption. So this is the most accurate, reliable, validated study on the nutrient density of foods that we have to date. So what did it tell us? Well, 4 out of the top 7 foods were organ meats. The liver had a score of 11. Spleen, which is probably not on many people's plate and menu at this point, was 62. So even the difference there was a 5-fold difference in nutrient levels, even between liver and spleen. So liver is so potent that even the next closest organ meat is 5 times less nutrient dense than it. That's how nutrient dense liver is. And I'm sure a lot of people have been hearing about liver a lot lately over the past few years. There's been a lot of discussion. Liver King has made quite a splash on social media. This is why. He might not be the best representative of liver for many reasons, but he's not wrong about the nutrient density of liver. Small dried fish, so those are like anchovies, sardines, mackerel, herring, 65. Dark leafy green vegetables, so this is the first plant food in this list and the only one in the top 10. So kale, collard greens, chard, excellent foods, very nutrient dense, and a lot of bioavailable nutrients. That's 72. Bivalves, so that like oysters, 90. Kidney, another organ, 125. Heart, another organ, 163. Crustaceans like shrimp, 193. And then we have goat at 205, beef at 275, and eggs at 281, and then cow's milk at 287. So this might be a surprising list to people. You know, as I said, 4 out of the top 7 foods are organ meats, and then if you include shellfish, you've got and fish. You have small dried fish, bivalves, and crustaceans also in the top 10. And then in general, animal foods like fish, beef, eggs, and milk comprise 17 of the top 20 foods on that list. So this does not mean that we should not eat vegetables. I want to be clear about that. At least that's my belief. There is a group of people out there, you know, the carnivore diet, who don't believe that we need vegetables. I'm not in that camp. And the reason for that is that what we've been talking about so far is the concentration of essential nutrients. So by that I mean vitamins and minerals that we know we cannot live without. These are critical to our health, and we will die. We die if we don't get them. If we, you know, everybody's heard of conditions like scurvy and rickets and beriberi and pellagra. These are severe acute diseases that can be fatal if we don't get these essential vitamins and minerals. But there is a whole nother class of nutrients that, while we may not die without them, we probably won't have optimal health without them. And this is somewhat controversial. I want to acknowledge that there's still a lot that we don't understand, but I think if we look at the bulk of modern clinical evidence and research, and also anthropological evidence, we learn that virtually all humans that we're aware of ate some combination of plant and animal foods, and these plant foods are high in phytonutrients like polyphenols, carotenoids, flavonoids, diallyl sulfides, and lignans, which are primarily found in plant foods. These were not included in the study that I just mentioned because, as I said, they were focusing on the essential nutrients and vitamins that we can't live without. But you know, if they had been included in the study, some plant foods would have definitely scored higher on that list. My point here is just that it's very difficult to obtain the optimal amount of nutrition on a 100% plant-based diet. And the best combination for most people is going to be some mix of plant and animal foods. And that could vary a lot from person to person, but some mix is, I think, the ideal.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
Most recent research suggests that over 90% of Americans fall short of the optimal intake of not just one, but several micronutrients. This is also true in other developed countries around the world. So there definitely has been a decline.